Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Legendarium podcast. Today is another Author's Shelf episode. They are coming fast and furious, and I absolutely love it. Today, I should introduce myself. I'm Craig, your host, and I am joined today by Nadia Uddin. Nadia, welcome.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Me too, because you chose The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. This is the second time, actually, in our Author's Shelf series that someone has chosen Ursula Le Guin. And both of them are books that I was telling you earlier before we turned on the camera. They're books that I know I should have read by now, but I never quite got around to it. So I'm really glad that you chose one of those books for me to finally cross off my list.
Yeah. I know you've read Dispossessed, and then you've also, I think as a kid, right? Or you read her Earthsea series?
Yeah, I read Earthsea when I was like a young adult. I think I was in my early 20s. I hated it, read it again, loved it. But when you're in your 20s, especially when you're in your early 20s, it's easier to either really, really love something or really, really hate something. And as we get older, certainly as I've gotten older, I've kind of leveled out with my emotions a little bit. And so now if there's something I dislike, it's like, it wasn't for me, whereas 15, 20 years ago, I would have been like on a crusade against that thing. So it's a little different. Anyway, so we should introduce you, Nadia. You have a book out now called Edison in the Hood. And this is, okay, wait, where's my notes? I wrote a one-liner on this. It's about artificial intelligence and fraught family relationships.
Oh, perfect. Oh my God. Can I just take you on tour?
It's about the little stuff. It's just, about the little things in life, right?
Yeah, it's about the little things in life. I started it 10 years ago, but now, AI is trending. So I'm like, oh, convenient.
That is good timing. 10 years. Wow. Okay. So that came out at just the right time.
It did.
So we're going to talk more about that at the end of the episode. But we should talk about The Left Hand of Darkness. Just to give people a quick overview, it's about our main character is Genli I, and he's on a mission to Gethin, an icy planet that he hopes to bring into the Ecumen. It's a collection of planets, or a galactic federation, if you will. But because of the nature of interstellar travel and some serious cultural and biological differences, Genli is having a tough time with that. Because the people on Gethin have no fixed gender most of the time, only acquiring one temporarily once a month for the purposes of sex and childbearing. What they do have, though, is a few nascent city-states on these separate continents, and thus an emerging sense of nationalism, we'll call it. I think she uses the word patriotism a lot in the book, and I think we can talk about that quite a bit.
For sure.
Anyway, so he has to navigate all this stuff, all while falling in love with another character and then losing that character and getting thrown in jail and wandering across giant ice sheets on this wintry planet. And it's that's basically it. Can he bring the planet into this federation, this Ecumen? That's the goal, and he has a whole lot of conversations along the way. It's a bit like The Dispossessed that way, right?
It is a little bit like The Dispossessed. I think that why I wanted to talk about this book so much is I have a conflicted relationship with Le Guin. I picked up Left Hand of Darkness when I started to write my own book, and a large part of almost the reason you brought it up, shame, right? She is probably one of the most canonized writers of our lifetime. She has a gazillion awards, on top of it, she's a woman in this space. She makes a lot of socio-political commentary in her book. So definitely picked it up, and it's a dense book. It's hard to read, and she forces you to slow down. So my first experience with the book was really just admiring the craft, the writing, the setting work, the plot, the structure. It's set up as a series of journal entries, almost academic papers, folklore, and turns it into this piece of fiction, So definitely fascinated with all those elements. I highlighted a ton out of it. I stole a bunch when I started writing my own book.
That's how you do it.
anytime somebody praises my line level writing, I'm like, okay, well, I stole most of that from Le Guin. But nobody needs to know that except, everybody now. But I didn't love it though. I couldn't, I was so focused on the writing and the craft. I couldn't really get into it. And it was just hard to follow. Now, to give Le Guin credit, I actually don't enjoy books very much anymore, any type of content, because I'm always analyzing it. I'm like, what's going on with characterization, that kind of stuff. The whole getting lost in a book, like, doesn't happen to me anymore. And I think I'm always chasing it, but again, I just can't help it. I'm always breaking things down, so I can't really get lost in it. So, still felt guilty that, I didn't fully appreciate the book. I was like, I have to love it. Everybody loves it. So I gave it a second read. And in that second read, I was able to, get past the technical elements and really appreciate the macro level philosophies that she's bringing into the picture. Understanding the plot a little more, because there are a lot of names, a lot of city states, and of course the names change. I'm like, why do authors do that? Like, why do the names have to change? I have to really just keep notes now. Still, got the plot or whatever. Was appreciating her commentary about gender and politics, and finding it relevant, but then also maybe somewhat dated as well. We can talk more about the gender politics in a second, and then, brought it to this stage, wanted to talk about it a little more, almost as a form of therapy, read it a third time and just loved it. Like, I'm like, this is the best book ever. I read it from front to back. I got lost in it. So definitely happy to now talk about it and share my opinions and evangelize it in a way I think, it hasn't necessarily been presented to me in other forms.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. First of all, I mean, we mentioned my issues with Wizard of Earthsea the first time I read it, and how I loved it on the reread. And then with this one, you said the first time you read it, you were distracted by the kind of the technical aspects, and then you kind of had to come back for the other stuff. For me, it was completely the opposite. I did have a tough time with this book, maybe in a similar, to a similar degree, I guess I should say, to what you were describing, but in the opposite way, where I wanted, like with the Dispossessed, one of my favorite paragraphs I think I've ever read in a book for this show was in The Dispossessed. It's not necessarily my favorite book we've ever read, but it was some amazing writing, and I was kind of blown away by what she was able to do on that line level, that paragraph level. But I was distracted in this book by the content, by the politics, by the commentary, by the stuff that my brain latched onto, where now I feel like I'm going to have to reread this, now that I know what she's saying and kind of what her views are in this book, going back to it and saying, okay, so let's get to the technical stuff. I need to actually read the lines a little more slowly and appreciate her art. And not just that commentary side of it. So, yeah, you and I had a little bit different approaches on this one. That's funny.
Yeah, different approaches, but at the end of the day, I think we ended up in the same spot. Of really just understanding why this book is so, why its virtues are extolled so much, and why it's going to be timeless. It is timeless, unless civilization ends, and then we have to start.
Actually, it's interesting you use that word timeless, because I was thinking about that very thing. This book was published 53 years ago, so it was 1960, I think. On the dot.
1969. Yeah, it came out when
or was it 69? Oh, yeah. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, I was going to say 1970, but 1969. So it's been around for 53 years now. If you gave somebody a high level overview, hey, what's the book about? It's a guy who travels around to these different countries, and he's trying to bring them into this federation, this ecumen, which is a word we should talk about. And he has a lot of conversations about gender and like gender politics and nationalism and patriotism and all that stuff, because that was what was in the air at the time she was writing this book. That stuff was all over the place. The kind of second wave radical feminists of the 60s, and the issues around the Cold War and the kind of nationalist politics and whatnot that brought up. And here we are 50 years later. And I heard somebody observe once that in a market style economy, for whatever reason, macroeconomics tend to operate on about a 50-year timeline, and it cycles between different aspects of that market economy. And I'm wondering now if that holds true for social issues as well, because yeah, 50 years ago, this was exactly what we were talking about. And then I went, okay, 50 years before that, it was kind of the tail end of the progressive era and the Wilson administration, and the exact same stuff. Well, okay, no, not the exact same stuff, but the same style of thing where it was about, we had women's suffrage, and uh, obviously the progressives were highly nationalistic at that time, and it was a whole thing. You go 50 years further back than that, and yeah, anyway, so you can do it
Yeah.
over and over again. So timeless, yeah. And I wonder if 50 years from now, people are going to be in a situation where they're going to pick up The Left Hand of Darkness and go, did she just write this?
Yeah.
Kind of like I was thinking.
It's either timeless or nothing has changed. Like it's like whatever perspective you want to take on that one. It does seem like, history does just keep repeating itself, and you know, everyone says it's profound because, the thought experiment of this book is, what if people had no gender? Or what if during that procreation period, or when they're in heat, like, you don't know who's what. There is a male and female situation, but you don't know who the male or the female is. Like, you don't know what you're going to be. So, and then the rest of the time you're kind of like androgynous. So, kind of in what we would say the they them world of today. She definitely isn't the first person who's talked about, gender and androgyny, and, transgender individuals have been around long before. So the conversation was happening before, it's happening during her time, and it's happening now as well. But I don't know if I necessarily see it as androgyny. I don't feel like she's talking about androgyny. In a way, when I read it the third time, I was like, oh wow, this is a love letter to like Taoism and those philosophies of like yin and yang, and light and darkness. There's a lot of duality, and we become one in that duality. Like, that's kind of like the heart of Taoism, and what she has talked about and written about, extensively. But I actually think it was more about asexuality, in terms of like, when you weren't in this, the characters, when they weren't in this camera stage. So camera is like, I guess, when they're, in heat, or, that's when procreation happens, where the gender becomes fluid. But the rest of the time, they're not chemering. They're asexual. And the characters in her book are primarily male. Like, did you get the sense that like they were all male? She had written, like, some feminists kind of challenged her, and they're like, well, why did you make everything mankind, he, him? Like, why didn't you use they, them? Or why weren't there any like female looking characters or sounding characters? And, she has written that it was maybe a little bit of a miss, but she just felt like it would be confusing to people if there was a they, them, and maybe that's what's changed is, in the 60s, 70s, maybe they, them would have been very, very, confusing, and now people state those pronouns. I still think it's confusing. I mean, unless you're in a bubble, a liberal bubble, they, them, you're like, okay, whatever, be whatever pronoun you want. I don't need subject verb agreement. Go for it. But, outside that bubble, people still are very confused, and it does unearth a lot of ire when you were telling people to change up their pronouns.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I'm in total agreement. Yes, outside of the bubble, it can get confusing. And honestly, just even if you are in the bubble, sometimes grammatically, it's like, okay, wait, I need to slow down. And so it does stop you in your tracks sometimes. But that's all fine. But back in the 60s, the feminists back then were already experimenting the way that people are now with alternate pronouns and whatnot. Like, this is not new, as you say, maybe just nothing's changed. So yeah, that was all going on. Gosh, there was something else you said that I wanted to respond to, but boy, now it's flown
Asexuality.
Oh, yeah, it's something about that. The thought experiment being, what if people were more or less stripped of their gender for most of their lives? And it felt like it was, you can talk about it from a kind of grand political perspective, how would society operate, and what would the different mores be around sex and sexuality and all that stuff, and that's all fine. But on a personal level, on an interpersonal level, how do you connect with those you meet?
Mhm.
Is there a way, and this is, I'm trying to put on my Le Guin hat here and say the thought experiment in a way is about how can you connect with somebody in a way that is beyond the sexual? And I don't just mean the sexual and whatever. It's when we're talking about gender roles and self-identifiers and
Mhm.
other identifiers. Is there something deeper? Is there a way to connect to somebody on a purely human level without that stuff? And I'm
Mhm.
not sure that it is totally possible, but it's an interesting concept for a book.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I think she even like struggles with it a little bit because she a lot of the first of all, Genry, the envoy, right, who's really
Mm-hmm.
his mission is to come just coordinate all these planets into like trade and knowledge sharing sort of institutions, no power, no class. She loves to talk about that. Every book, Earthsea series, Dispossessed, it's all about that.
Yeah.
What if class didn't exist, or power or social or whatever. But he essentially he's bad at his job, and he's a misogynist. Like he doesn't like feminine things. He kind of is speaks of women's qualities in a pejorative way, like, oh, he had a shrill feminine voice, and he couldn't think abstractly because he was a woman. So
Mm.
maybe that is why he really wasn't able to do what he could do. I mean, I don't mean to do any spoiler alerts, but it's at the end of the day, he doesn't get the job
53-year-old
done.
book. Let
Yeah,
her rip.
yeah. I don't know if there's honestly, there aren't even like these major plot twists. He doesn't get the job done. He ends up leaning on this Estroven guy, who I feel like is the ideal figure in the Le Guin mind of how a human should be, right? He cares about
Yeah.
the whole. He doesn't have this power struggle. But yeah, I think the at the crux of it, she writes a lot about, I think, cultural evolution versus biological evolution, like race, class, gender. These are all things that we've made up as part of our cultural evolution, versus biological evolution. So the people on the planet that he visits are a form of like they develop this asexuality or this androgyny as a form of like evolution, adaptation. I think they were
Mm.
brought from another planet, and so that's why they have this androgynous being. They're still human, but they're different because they are like that. And poor Genry, the envoy, is considered this pervert because he's, as she describes, always a low grade Kemmering. Like he's just like always aroused. I get not heavily aroused, like in a full Kemmer, but somewhat aroused. So
I need to, by the way, adopt this. Is such perfect language. You need a little euphemism for, oh, I'm in full Kemmer, baby.
right, we're in full Kemmer. We are PG-13. You have no idea what I'm talking about because you haven't read this book. But she also struggles with that because in these conversations they're like, yeah, can you just look at me as a human being without gender? But then she's like, but women can get pregnant, and it's like,
Right.
women have their periods, so it's just like there is that truth, that evolutionary biological aspect of us that we can't get around. Even like somebody addressed, oh, but men are more physical, and she's like, oh, with the machines, what does it matter? It's true, but at the end of the day, you can get pregnant, which is, I think, why it's so important that she wanted this duality, this male-female form, to happen during like a procreation moment. And I don't know if Kemmering in her mind was just about reproduction, because I think it was also like you can enjoy it. I think they were like contraceptives also at that time, but having that sexual lust within a very contained period, I think for her was like, that's where the thought experiment was, and then what happened outside of that as well. But yeah, definitely very similar themes throughout all her books.
By the way, I remembered what it was that I was going to respond to. But no, it was about the whole pronoun thing. She starts the book almost. It might be like chapter 3 or 4, but she starts the book with a discussion about why she's always using he, him pronouns and what that does, and how that it does kind of slightly bend your mind toward the masculine as a default. And anyway, that's all. But But as you say, what are you going to do? You bump up against reality. As you say, yeah, you're going to have your period.
Yeah, yeah.
There are certain realities that that she kind of acknowledges in this book in a way. I have to write it this way, but by writing it this way, I am going to influence the way you think about these kind of androgynous people that you're running up against in the book. You are going to think about them as male. Sorry.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
tough. Yeah, it's
It's
a tough tightrope to walk.
yeah, she was born in 1929, so her approach also is dated in the sense that for her it was very normal to say mankind meant humankind, and he was the
Mm-hmm.
universal pronoun. She writes about that as well, so it felt natural to her, I think, and it was a safe assumption that using man instead of human was normal and not that discouraging. But yeah, it still ended up bending things towards the male side for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other big topic in the book, there's the gender politics, but then there's also the question of nationalism and patriotism. This is well, I guess we can kind of introduce this by mentioning what I mentioned earlier, the word ecumen. That's
Mm-hmm.
the what I call it, the Galactic Federation
Right,
of
right, right.
planets, right? They
The
call it the
ideal
ecumen,
state.
which of course is going to call to mind the word ecumenical, which is like representing a body of churches, right? It's commonly used in Christianity. Like if you're going to have an ecumenical conference, it's a bunch of people coming together and trying to universalize something, right? So,
Well, you
but in this
definitely
case,
told me on that. I had no idea. I thought it was like maybe a play off acumen, but
oh
yeah.
right,
I
yeah,
often miss a lot of religious references too because I didn't grow up Christian. So I'm thank you for educating me
I
on
I tip my decorative religious hat and say, you're welcome. Yeah, I definitely grew up in a heavily religious family and area and tradition. So yeah, a lot of this stuff is yeah, it's kind of the water that this fish swims in.
that. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so that's she spends a lot of the book talking about gender issues, but a lot of the book kind of preaching um, globalist attitude
Mm-hmm.
through these characters and through the conversations that they have, and even with the word the ecumen and the way she talks about this kind of utopian individual societies that have coalesced into a utopian overall federation, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the book was. Is it interesting? Are they interesting questions? Yes, but I felt like she was on less firm footing here. When it came to the gender stuff, I might agree or disagree with that, this or that or the other, but she was asking interesting questions in an interesting way, and I enjoyed reading about that. When it came to the kind of grand political themes of this, I was like, I had a hard time with it.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite lines is just like, "Are we a nation? Or are we just a bunch of quarreling families?" And I'm like, yeah,
Mm,
I feel like that's kind of where we are too. Especially like places in the Middle East, where like everybody stop quarreling. Not to like make that too reductive, but I think another reason why I wanted to talk about this book is, with COVID and what happened in 2020, I think we
mm,
became hyper aware of like what globalization meant and how we were so connected. We're not sort of these isolated nations by, from a biological standpoint,
right.
viruses want to replicate and they don't care. They'll come over the ocean, whatever it may be. So it felt like, yeah, it was kind of like it was maybe the discussions were a little superficial, right? And it was hard to really see if she had a good stance as to how things should be, right? So these coordinate planets and they share knowledge and there's no power, there are no laws, everything is just coordinated, coordinated, coordinated.
Yep.
She didn't really go into like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? The
Or
planet
how
showed
did
up.
they achieve this?
Right.
Yeah.
But when our envoy goes to Gethin, is that the name of the
The
planet?
first
Yeah.
place. Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very different. There's a king and there's, structures, class structures, and they're like, pieces of land that they're fighting over. So it's just like, is that, are they the enlightened society, or, are these, intergalactic connections the ideal state? There really wasn't a stance, I don't think.
It was
Unlike
I
Dispossessed,
felt
where I feel
like
like Dispossessed, it was clear, right? There's like this
sure,
one
yeah.
planet.
I mean, that's the whole point of the Dispossessed, I guess. In this case, I felt like as I was reading it, what she was saying is, I'm going to take a character from an idealized future, and I'm going to put him in our past. Not too far, several hundred years into our past. Well, okay, maybe a millennium or so. The city state is just starting to kind of emerge as a political entity, and so then you have wars of nationalism, instead of whatever people were fighting out about before. And what she was saying, I felt like, was, here's a society that could go differently than ours did if they made different choices. And she wanted them to leapfrog by joining the Ecumen. Mm-hmm. She wanted them to leapfrog the tumultuous modernization that we went through as, the various societies across the earth, right? Something along those lines. But like you said, it's you use the word superficial, and I think that's a fair word. I don't mean to. I mean, hey, it's Ursula Le Guin, like you said. It's disparage at your own peril, right? But it does feel, when I read her politics, a little bit like John Lennon politics.
Yeah.
Like, imagine there's no countries. Like, okay, all right, thanks, John.
Yes.
Have a nice day.
Right. You had a dream. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyway. Yeah, I did have a tougher time with that, because her definitions, I think, are imperfect with these political concepts. So she talks about patriotism a lot, and there's an interesting question there. Let's see if I can find the quote. I've got the quote here somewhere. Estraven asks him if he knows what patriotism is. And Genly responds, I don't think I do, if by patriotism you don't mean the love of one's homeland. And then Estraven replies, I don't mean love when I say patriotism. I mean fear, the fear of the other. Mm-hmm. And I know that is an operative way that some people do think about the world. I get that. This is kind of a book in some measure about xenophobia, and that's all totally fair. But if you want to talk about nationalism as that sort of thing, that's fair. But I kind of separate nationalism and patriotism in my mind, where Estraven later says, what is love of one's country? Is it hate of one's uncountry? Mm-hmm. And it's just, I don't think that's a fair starting point if you're going to talk about patriotism. And so it's an interesting question and an interesting direction to go. I just felt like her, like I said earlier, her foundation, her feet weren't under her quite as firmly as with the other issues in the book. So
yeah, she definitely had stronger opinions, I think, of other issues, and even with patriotism, lately it feels like it's a pejorative word, just because it's like patriots stormed the Capitol, right?
It's been a bit politicized.
I don't like patriots now, whatever it may be. But yeah, it's hard to really say, like, okay, well, do I come out with a stronger opinion, or do you feel more enlightened now based on these discussions? How she approached it? Not really,
Right. Yeah, I think that's all fair enough. So what else do you have any favorite lines, anything specific to the craft of this book? Favorite moments, favorite lines that you wanted to bring up? We've talked a lot about the conceptual side, the stuff that I had the harder time with, but what about the stuff that you were so in love with that you were distracted by your first time through?
I think that, like, I love, again, how she brings in kind of, in a way, so there's the Chinese author, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it correctly, Tao Ji. And she's written
we do the best we can.
Yes. And she's written a ton about him. She actually did like a translation of his work. She doesn't know Chinese, but she like cobbled pieces together or whatever. So she really, takes his work to the point of appropriation.
Mm.
It's like, it's basically, lines like, uh, happiness has to do reason and only reason earns it. And, words like that, in terms of like, things that are contradictive, and, in all time past is, in all time to come it is, it has not been, nor yet will it be, it is all, like lines like that, where, um, I highlighted them. I liked them. It felt philosophical, but it also, I feel, is just, again, pure appropriation of that writing as well. And again, she doesn't hide the fact that she's a fan of that, but I definitely liked it when it got into those spaces. And just, every now and then there'll just be moments that are funny between these characters. And, again, I got to like the characters a little bit more once I read it for the third time. So, overall, I think the book came together for me in the third reading, where the beauty of the writing and the structure, actually felt married very well with, the actual storyline and the plot. And, I felt like there is a propulsion, like, with it, because it is, at the end of the day, this guy's journey, right? He's trying to get from point A to point B. And, there is sort of that, like, you kind of wonder, that keeps you reading. You're like, so is this guy going to succeed or not? Are we getting into this coordinated planet state or what? And then she has such a dedication to, I think, the truthfulness of the book. Like, a large part of the second half is them in this journey going to, through the lands of trying to escape, and it's pages and pages of them trucking through this ice and glaciers. And she had studied, people who had taken these treks on Antarctica, because she wanted it to be, realistic. But we're like, who would know that if it was realistic or not, but it was just such a dedication to that, which I appreciate. And she is definitely, I'm almost jealous as how indulgent she can be, because it's like, there are some parts where it just reads like, her academic paper on anthropology, or, there's this whole section towards the back. Like, I think when you get to the 95th percent mark, you could almost put it down, because she's getting in the specifics of, here's the cycle of the land, and here's what they consider an hour, and here's this. It's just like all this stuff. You're like, okay, go Ursula, write it down. I need to write it down, but go with it. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's interesting to read that level of, today we call it world building, whatever they would have called it back then. That level of world building in a pretty short book. As you say, this is thick in its language and its concepts and all that, but it's not that long a book. But she spends a lot of time building that world out for you. And as I was reading this one, of course, I'm going to compare it to the other Le Guin books that I've read and the ones that we've talked about. She's always very straightforward with her language. She doesn't take a lot of rhetorical detours. But in this book, compared to The Dispossessed, and compared to Earthsea, the language felt colder and less personal. And I was thinking about this as I was reading the book, and I wondered if, and maybe, as a writer yourself, maybe you can shed some light on this. Is that, what's the chicken and what's the egg? So she comes up with the setting and says, okay, it's going to be this ice planet. The nickname is going to be Winter. It's so icy.
Yes, you're just cold as you read it. You're cold. You're like,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so she comes up with this setting. This is where I'm going to put my book. She starts writing it. Does she consciously put in language? No, I don't just mean like the word cold or frozen or whatever, but something about her approach to the characters and their distance from her as an author and you as a reader. It all feels cold and distant compared to her other books. Is that conscious, or by choosing that setting, does she I don't know what the analogy would be, like bundling up, like separating herself and writing that way. I'm curious, is that accidental or is that purposeful? It's
Yeah,
hard to imagine anything with Le Guin not being purposeful, right?
right. You're like, she made every decision. Nothing is accidental. I think the academic in her really came out in this book. And that's what I mean. It's like indulgent, right? Because it's like she does
Yeah.
her lineage. She comes from professors, PhDs. And sometimes, you want to write like that. So she set up this book where it's like a series of papers. Like the reader is basically discovering like, this, this, this quest to again, have this planet join this other coordinated group of planets. So yeah, you'll be reading a first person like journal account, and then there'll be some folklore in there, and then there'll actually be transcripts, right? So if it's a transcript, it's not that, personal as well. And so I do think that she wanted to maybe get to the point a little bit more, or wanted to be more academic in her writing. It's still beautiful prose, but that's why it's so hard, because it's like, it's almost like you're reading, a white paper on her observations of gender neutrality and that sort of stuff. So, and that's why I mean, it's indulgent, because I know with my book too, like I like to have these sections that are very like, there's conversational and that kind of stuff. And I don't feel like making it dialogue-y. I don't feel like making it realistic. I almost want these like highly intellectual conversations to be happening. And either you like it or you don't. It's same with Dispossessed. Either you're going to go with it. You're not going to be like, obviously people don't talk like this when, they're at the gym or at the bar, but I think that she definitely like went full forward in terms of just being able to write in that manner.
When I talked about The Dispossessed with Mary Robinette Kowal, and people should go listen to that. That was a fun episode.
That was a good one.
I made the observation, and I know a lot of people hated it, and I know why they hated it, but I'm going to make it again. That reading these two books by Le Guin reminded me forcibly of reading Robert Heinlein. We did Starship Troopers years ago on the podcast. Now, it doesn't remind me of that because they share the same politics. Oh, no. but because Robert Heinlein does a similar thing to what you're talking about, where he's like, you know what? I know. Yeah, people don't talk this way. I don't care. I've got something to say. And I'm not publishing in academic journals. I'm publishing fiction. So it's going in my story.
Yes.
So you'll have chapters long breaks from the action so that two characters can talk about the nature of patriotism. And so so for all of you people who hate Heinlein out there or love, don't want them compared. Sorry. That's all I mean, is that they love to get their ideas in there that way.
Yeah. I almost feel like just establish your expectations. You're going to enjoy the book a lot more if you just know that, you're going to get the type of writing that is completely unrealistic in terms of how people actually speak.
Right. Well, that being said, actually, let's move on to some final thoughts here. The question I'll ask
already?
you.
Oh my God.
No. I know. It's been 40 minutes.
Oh my God.
The question I want to ask you is a one I ask almost everybody, which is, how do you and to whom do you recommend this book?
Oh, yeah. And the thing is, it's so recommended, right? It's like on every list ever.
Right.
Books to read, sci-fi, that kind of stuff. I would definitely recommend it to any person who needs to study like the craft, how to master it, the elements of it. It's almost like, taking a course that you would maybe have to go through an MFA to get, in terms of like, if you want to just learn how to do it really well. But in terms of like, who else would really be into it? That's actually a pretty tough question, right? Like, if you're into fantasy, if you're into sci-fi, speculative, I don't know. Who would you recommend it to? I'm actually curious.
It's as you say, if somebody wants to study the craft, reading as much Le Guin as you can is never a bad idea, right? somebody who is interested by the questions we've been talking about, the questions of patriotism, questions of gender roles or gender identities and all that stuff. As you say, you can tell it was written 50 years ago, and not every idea is exactly current, but it still is going to ping some of those same centers in your brain. And so somebody who's interested in those topics, but then also anybody who's interested in kind of a survey of the historical landscape of science fiction. This was, I mean, it won the Hugo, it won the Nebula.
So many.
It won everything else that year, as far as I can tell. And it has been an influential work for 53 years now. So your favorite writer has read this book, and it has probably influenced them in some way, right?
Definitely.
And so even if it's just for the educational aspect of, I don't know, that it feels unfair. And this isn't the only reason I recommend the book, but I guess I would say it is valuable to have read it, even if it isn't your favorite book to read on your first time through. But like other Le Guin, it's going to be rereadable. It's that reread is necessary, right?
The reread is necessary, and it could be only 300 pages, and you're like, I can get through this in a weekend. No, it's going to take a few weeks. Yeah. I think it's also good for somebody who like maybe likes to be a little confused or not necessarily know what they're reading. Like I'm a big fan of like Murakami. I like Richard Powers. You know, like these are very dense books that like. You kind of like, I have no idea what I just read, but I feel something, you know, I'm getting an emotion out of it. So I think if you're really into having that kind of reading experience as well, I would recommend this for sure.
That's in a very different genre. That's how I often describe having read the Silmarillion for the first time. So, you know, Tolkien's big mythology, and I was 17 and I read 300 pages of this thing. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I loved it.
Yes.
And so I immediately reread it and started to get it. You know, sometimes all you need is to feel something out of a book. You don't have to come to a conclusion about all the various things we talked about today.
Yeah, that's all you want to do as a writer. You want somebody to feel, you know. So
yeah. Well, there you go. An excellent pick, Nadia. I'm so glad that I can cross this one off my TBR list and put it on my TBRR list for later. But let's talk about your book, Edison in the Hood. Now, my line, what was it? It's about artificial intelligence and fraught family relationships. Do you want to give us more of a pitch and let us know what this book is about?
Yeah. It follows the story of a brother and sister. At the heart of it is a family, and, you know, a lot of conflict, very strained. I think a lot of people can relate to that. And they receive a technology from like a Ray Kurzweil type character. Actually, my whole character is based on Ray Kurzweil, if you're a fan. But a technology that would use artificial intelligence to help mend their relationships. And so as they kind of grapple with the morality of such technology, and a subversive radical group, you got to have the anarchy, you know, get wind of this technology and have a very different vision.
Says the Le Guin fan. The Le Guin fans say, you got to have some anarchists in there somewhere.
Yeah. So they have a different vision of it. So can artificial intelligence fix our most challenging relationships? That's my thought experiment.
And that's so interesting. And as you say, timely, because it's a bit like we're all looking at artificial intelligence right now. Mm-hmm. But we're looking at what our right hand is doing with it, while our left hand is still kind of mysterious. So we think about, how is it going to affect the economy? Will I still, will truck drivers still have a job when artificial intelligence really comes into play, you know, or what have you? But we don't think necessarily about how is Chat GPT going to affect my family relationships? And you know, the line there might be a little more tenuous or difficult to discern, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And you know, these things will have an effect, and they're going to look a lot different than they do now. You know, who knows? I mean, artificial intelligence. I was one of the first of my friends to have an email address back in 1993. And like, so you say the internet, this thing where you can send whatever
Yes.
instantaneously across the world, and then you describe the internet now to somebody in 93, and it's a whole different beast. And so who knows what AI is going to look like in 20 years? It's going to be
No,
wild.
yeah, and it's rapidly, like, it's just compounding the acceleration. My book takes place in the year 2030, and a lot of people are like, I feel like this technology is way too advanced. I don't think this is going to happen in 2030. And I'm like,
Yeah.
just you wait. It's just, what you think is happening now is going to happen at a rate 10 times more. So,
Well, I will let me give my own pitch for why people might want to pick up this book. Longtime listeners of the show have heard my wife, Sarah. She's been on the show a few times. So they're familiar with how much better and smarter she is than me. That's fine. But your book, I think your agent, your publicist, maybe you, I don't know, somebody sent me a copy of the book of Edison in the Hood. And it shows up, and I read the back of it, and I go, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. And I read the first chapter, and I went, Sarah, I think you'd like this a lot. And again, for those who have listened to the show for a long time, they know that Sarah and I do not have the same tastes often when it comes to what we read. But I said, I think you would really like this. And I haven't seen it
like
since.
basically like, it's
So,
not for me, but it's for you.
No. What I'm saying is I'm liking this, and I think you'll like this. I got through the first chapter and went, ooh, this might be up your alley. Maybe this is something we can share. And I haven't seen it since. It's she's been reading it herself. So
oh my God, I love it. Tell her to post a review for me on Goodreads.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So anyway, yeah, that was poorly phrased, but no, that's what I meant was something we can both enjoy. So
oh my God,
that's
that's
wide
like the
appeal.
nicest thing. That's the nicest thing. Thank you. You're making my heart sing.
Well, there you go. Nadia Uddin, thank you so much for coming on the show and for picking a book that I'm sure will get our Discord server lighting up with a lot of people talking. Much appreciated.
Yes. Thank you for having me and using this as an excuse me to read it, for the third time. So happy to talk about it. Check it off the list. We've done the essentials in terms of reading, and can appreciate her for who she is now.
There you go. And for the rest of you, thank you so much for listening. Thelegendarium.com is where you can go and find past episodes grouped by either by author or in this case by the author's shelf. So we've done, at least a couple dozen of these at this point. The author's shelf episodes are some of my favorite that we've ever done. So you can find all of those at thelegendarium.com. You can also find links to Discord to join in the conversation and yell about me about my views on Joe Abercrombie's books or whatever you want. And you can also find the link to our Patreon page. And for those of you who support the show already, thank you so much. And for those of you who don't yet, it would mean a lot to us if you throw a buck in the tip jar for these episodes that we make for you. And with that, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you again, Nadia, for coming on, and I will see everybody next time.
Thanks.